Namaste and welcome to everybody for this very first class on the discussion group that we're going to have. You could say it's class, yes, but I'm going to encourage some question and answers and discussion as we go along. And it's the very first one on the book, Out of the Labyrinth. As you came to join this class, you saw it on the screen, that beautiful book with the constellation, Out of the Labyrinth. And I would point your attention to the subtitle of the book, For Those Who Want to Believe But Can't. And this was Swami's intention, Swami Kriyananda's intention in writing that book, was to give hope and encouragement to people in this modern age that we find ourselves in, this modern age of science, of scientific materialism, skepticism, disbelief, that people find themselves in, and it shakes their foundation and their spiritual beliefs of foundation. And Swami wrote this book in order to reach that audience. And so it's my pleasure and it's my honor to be able to share this discussion group with you. And I hope that you will find this of interest as I have over the years. So I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about what I intend for the class, why this class, and how we're going to go about going forward with this class. Now, some of you were with us when we were doing our previous class series. We were doing a long one on the autobiography of a yogi. And this, of course, will not be like that, nor as long. And I was asked, how long do you anticipate going for? And I think what we're going to do is probably be 5, 6, maybe even 7 classes, certainly by the end of the year, probably will finish. And I want to not so much go chapter by chapter here, but I want to cover the themes that Swami Kriyananda spoke about in this book. And as we go about the themes, and if you have questions, comments about that, please write them in the chat box. And I may not be able to get to them in the particular class, like today's class, if you have questions, but I'll try to come back in future classes to address them in the next class perhaps, and address those questions, so long as the questions are pertinent to the topics that we're covering in this class series. Now, why this class? Out of the Labyrinth. Some of you have read, and if you haven't, please do, read that introduction that I asked Bart to send to everybody, which Swami writes. I took extracts from his writings about how it came to be that he wrote this class and what his intention was for writing this book. Now, as you know, I met Swami Kriyananda in 1968, and that was at the time where he was writing this book and just about getting ready to publish it, which he did in the first edition. And this was the cover. Is that reversed? Anyway, Crisis in Modern Thought. And that was its original title, because he felt that modern thought, particularly for those people of spiritual beliefs, there was a crisis. It was a crisis that science itself and modern society had, you might say, slowly been undermining the foundation of many people's worldview, spiritual worldview. And it was having a great impact subtly upon society, the way people were approaching thoughts that were common in this modern world. And he felt that values were being undermined, that there was a sense of growing meaninglessness that was arising particularly within Western society. Because Swami, he wrote this primarily for Western society, but he pointed out the impact of ideas from the West are permeating throughout the world. and even into India today, that you find, because of its embrace of Western technology and Western modernism, you'll find that these ideas are becoming common worldwide. And he wanted to counter those ideas and give an alternate interpretation to some of those ideas that were at the foundation of what modern thought, as he termed it, crisis in modern thought. And so he wrote this book, and as it's explained in that introduction that I sent to you, and I hope Bara will place it in the chat network, a link to that, so that you can read that if you haven't. Swami found himself in the late 50s, 1960s in India. He was serving as you could say an ambassador for Master's teachings from Self-Realization Fellowship, the headquarters in Los Angeles. And he had come to India in the late 1950s, came with Dayamata and some of the other sisters from Self-Realization Fellowship as representatives. And when Dayamata returned to America in 1958, Swami Kriyananda was tasked with staying on in India to carry forward some of the ideas that had arisen at that time and to try to bridge and create a link between the Master's teachings, YSS and SRF, and to further Master's work in India at that time. Well, as we know, that eventually led to Swami's departure. He was asked to leave Self-Realization Fellowship because some of his ideas were a bit too radical. Of his time, his life in 1958 to 1962, he was extremely active. And at that time, Swami Kriyananda was the #1 public representative of Master's teachings for Self-Realization Fellowship. So much of his life up to that point, through the 1950s, has been one of teaching, of presenting Master's teachings out to the public. And in that role, Swami was cognizant of where his audience was coming from, what they were expecting, what they wanted to hear, what the you might say the counter arguments were to what he was presenting. So he had to put himself in the mindset of his audience, and this is true for any public speaker. When I teach classes in meditation teacher training, the first class I always begin with is I say, know your audience. And you have to address your topics to what that audience's understanding is, what questions they are, maybe not spoken, but unspoken questions that they have. And so Swami was this. He was a world traveler. He was speaking in Europe. He was speaking in Australia. And he was obviously speaking at that time in India. And so he had to know his audience. And at about that time, he read an article in a magazine that was put out by an information service of the US government in India, and it was called SPAN. And there was an article in there by a gentleman who was asserting that modern religion was old-fashioned, that there was new thought had arisen, and effectively the values that modern religion was promulgating, the ancient values, you could say, they're promulgating in a modern world, were no longer applicable. The solutions that were being proposed by modern religion were no longer applicable in today's world. And it was a very materialistic point of view. And Swami read that and he says, no, that's not right. Somebody needs to speak to the other point of view. And he looked about and he didn't see anybody speaking to that, giving those people who were coming up in a very materialistic mindset, materialistic world, were not answering them from a position of religion, a position of spirituality, of how modern world so the problems of the modern world can be approached from a spiritual point of view. The modern religion is science. This is what people think, and there's some truth to that too. This is the modern religion of science is going to be the answer, and science is based upon a very materialistic point of view, or so it was presented by this article. And so seeing this, and then Swami began to look about him, and he began to see that, yes, modern philosophy, very materialistic. Modern philosophy does not believe in necessarily values that are ancient to our understanding as spiritual seekers that are the foundation of the spiritual path. And he felt that a crisis in modern thought was taking place, and that people, they wanted to believe in spiritual principles. They wanted to believe in what religious teachings were, but they were finding it increasingly difficult to do that because modern science says, modern philosophy says, that's applicable to the past. We now are in a new age, and we need a new basis of understanding. And that basis that was being proposed was modern scientific materialism. This world is essentially what? Matter. And that consciousness is a function of the brain waves, that our very being is a result of unconscious forces, scientific forces, which is no direction in life at all. And he felt, I believe truly, that if society as a whole is basing its understanding on principle, what will that do? It's nihilistic. It's a rejection of all basic values, that there are no values. And so what happens? You have ultimately, his feeling was, you're going to have civilization decay. Society will decay unless it has a foundation of universal principles that have not just are based on belief, that are based upon certain fundamental truths. And as I'm going to read a quote that Swami said. He said, "Our present is a new and unfamiliar world of relativities. It is important that we find some meaningful substitute for our lost sense of meaning." So in this environment, Swami there in the early 1960s began to think somebody needs to answer these questions. And he took it upon himself to do that. Now, it took him many years to be able, because he had other duties as well, but he says it took him 14 years of study and to clarification of his own thoughts. And he wrote that first edition, Crises in Modern Thought, as a result. Now, he had hopes that this would be a bestseller, you might say. He thought every book he ever wrote was going to be a bestseller. And of course, it was not a bestseller, because this is a book that is, in a sense, a book of philosophy, a book of one needs to take of serious consideration and thinking about. And he, on one side, he knew that most people are not interested in those sorts of books. It was not going to be popular, but he always had this hope. And when I came to know him, he would recommend, he says, you should read this, especially when first it was in manuscript form, but then when the book was published in the early 1970s, printed finally, he said, please read it, please read it. And very few did. I mean, I did, of course. And if, somebody who wanted to attune themselves with Swami, we always read every book he wrote, because we wanted to attune ourselves to his thinking. But as time has gone by, fewer and fewer people, I think, in the Ananda work have read this book. And when I came to India in 2005, I noticed that hardly anybody in India has read this book. It's there on the shelf. It's the black book with the constellation in front of it, and people aren't interested in it. And what I have said to others, and which I'd say to you too, if you want to understand Swami, you should read this book. If you want to understand where his thought process, how the evolution of his thought process and the way that he presents the teachings, you should read this book. Because it was these questions that he raises in this book that he was addressing when he was speaking. Now, I can understand why devotees in India haven't read this book so much, is because when Swami, his spirituality evolved over his lifetime. And by the time he came to India in 2003, to stay for extended periods of time and to make that his, you might say, his second or third home, Italy, America, and then India, he had entered a different phase of his life. It was that last phase of his life where his focus was on devotion. His focus was on Guru Bhakti, Guru Seva. And he wasn't interested so much anymore in the intellectual side and that rational side, you might say, that was very much to the fore in the early years of his life.